Nancy is simply the kindest person I have ever known. Bar none. And I'm profoundly grateful to her for being my companion and friend. And she's taught me most of what I know about being a healthy human. And one of the things that's a major irritation about Nancy is that I read all these journal articles and scientific books and try to figure out how to do things right, and Nancy reads none of them, and she's 10 times as good a parent as I am and spouse. And turns out, related to what we'll talk about today, that the condition of our heart matters a lot more than the contents of our minds. And so I hope you sense that as we progress through our discussion today. Anything you'd like to say, dear?
No, but he's awesome. Yes.
Oops, are we tangled? There we go. Thank you, dear. What a treat to be with you today. And I appreciate Andy and Natalie, who are the doinest people I know. I suspect that they could create the space program from the ground up in a week, and they're just doers, and I appreciate them. And hope that I think we're scheduled to have about 3 hours together, and my hope is that what we do will be useful to you. But let me start right off the bat with, in my work for the university, we often we develop not only parenting and marriage and personal well-being materials, but we also do workshops. So we have a program, and Andy might even have a copy back there. Yeah, Nancy, you want to hold up a marriage garden? We have a program that we use on the marriage garden. It talks about 6 key principles in couple relationships, and that's the kind of thing you generally expect when you go to a workshop that's about couple relationships. You expect to hear about those core principles and how they operate. And turns out that there's some stuff that we haven't. Andy? Oh, no, that'd be great. They don't happen to have a boom, do they? Oh, guess what? They might have it right here if they have a clip. But I'll be glad to hold it until we find something. Okay, thank you. So for instance, let me just do a little pre-check. How many of you have read a book by John Gottman, like 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work? Anyone here read that book? A couple people have. It's kind of the classic book. And John Gottman is literally the 800-pound gorilla in the area of couple relationships. He's the one who really has challenged the old myths and helped us to see couple relationships in very different ways. And so, not uncommonly in workshops, we spend a lot of time talking about the things he discovered. Thank you, Andy. I like to have my hands free to gesture, you know. So let me give you a couple of examples to set the context. He talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And if you know from biblical lore, those are the final destructive angels who will wreak havoc on the earth. But when John Gottman, a good practicing Jewish man, talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, he's talking about the marital apocalypse. Those 4 common behaviors that undermine healthy relationships. They just pull the rug out on working together. And I'll mention in brief the 4 horsemen. The first one is complaint. And complaint is more than just having a suggestion of how things might be done differently. Complaint suggests there's something wrong with the person to whom you're married, that they're fundamentally flawed. So you sometimes make complaints. We say things like, man, all you ever think about is yourself. And sometimes we don't verbalize it that directly, that brutally, but that's not an uncommon way that we see each other. We say, wow, you don't think about me. Just a side note, it's my sense that whenever we accuse someone else of being selfish, it's because we're assuming they should be ministering to us, which is fundamentally selfish. So the first complaint, and then the second is contempt. Contempt. Contempt is the most corrosive of all the horsemen in the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Contempt suggests that the person doesn't really even have value. Just think, oh, you make me sick. It's not surprising that that's not very healthy for strengthening relationships. Then there's defensiveness. And I hope some of you are not thinking, wow, I could really use these. Because these, of course, are very destructive. Number 3, defensiveness, is where maybe we say something like, you think my mom's crazy, let's talk about yours for a while. And it's when we have moved to the point where, having been hurt, we want to hurt back. And the objective of our discussion is no longer about improving the relationship. It's about landing blows, scoring points, causing pain. That's number 3. Number 4 is stonewalling. Stonewalling. Stonewalling is when one partner or the other says, look, this is a waste of time. We shouldn't be having this discussion. This is done. I'm going to do something else. Now, you want to guess whether it's men or women who most commonly do stonewalling? Pardon? 85% of the time, stonewalling is done by men. Now, there's of course the 15%, and some of you may be pleased to be in that 15%, ladies. But very special ladies. The way we talk about this culturally is a woman is trained in her life experience to believe that when a person cares about you, they stay in conversation with you. They stay and listen and talk and work things through. I mean, I assume that you noticed, as I did, that in junior high school, it mystified me that girls could not go to the restroom with about 4 or 5, 6 friends. And I wasn't quite sure why it required so much help. But guys don't do that. A guy has never asked me to go to the restroom with him. And if I asked, I'd say, you're on your own. You got this. You don't need my help. Now, as silly as that may seem, the reality is that in our culture, and perhaps in fact by nature, women tend to be in conversation and connected. The way John Gottman says it is women join teams so they can hang out with their friends. Boys join teams so they can kick somebody's backside. Now, are those different mindsets that could cause a certain amount of tension? But returning to stonewalling, so if a woman knows that you care because you stay in conversation, you're willing to stick with it until you've worked it through, but a man thinks, this is stupid, we're just escalating, we're increasing the conflict, and so he feels very noble as he departs from the conversation. He feels like he's doing the right thing as he departs from the conversation. I don't want us to fight, this is silly, so I'm not going to fight. But commonly, a woman feels deserted. Deserted. You don't care enough to work this through? You're just willing to kiss it all goodbye? And so you can see the amazing irony. Men do what they think is noble and positive and helpful, and women experience it commonly as very destructive and indifferent and unhelpful. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. By the way, talking about gender differences, is it men or women who are most likely to initiate a relationship conversation? Who is it who says, honey, there's some things we need to talk about? Yeah, it's far more likely that the woman will initiate the conversation. There is hardly anything so big that a man can't gladly sweep it under the rug and ignore it. but women want to talk and fine-tune and be connected. So now those are the kind of things we often talk about when we talk about couple relationships, and we even then make some recommendations. Research suggests that that men self-soothe. That is, when a woman says, "Sweetheart, there's some things we need to talk about," what he hears is, "Honey, you're a mess, and I have outlined 27 points that you could work on, and I might be able to rescue you from your unbelievable stupidity." That's what a man hears. And what's interesting is we often think of women as volatile, but it's really men who are physiologically volatile. Their heart rate goes through the roof. It's like, and their heart rate goes up to like 160 beats per minute. They start to imagine their spouse is a saber-toothed tiger, and this does not lead to healthy conversations. I mean, that's the common pattern. Woman initiates, man becomes almost immediately overwhelmed, flooded, aroused. He's just so overwhelmed. I don't know what I did wrong, but I know that I'm going to be blamed for everything, including the coal shortage in South America. That's how they feel. No one says that it's because of what you have said in the past, but merely that men didn't grow up going to the restroom with their friends, and they don't know quite how you do this. Let's just talk and figure this out kind of thing. So the recommendations, not surprisingly, are for women to soften the startup. Soften the startup. There are softer and harsher ways to start up a conversation, aren't there, ladies? Like a softer way might be, "Sweetheart, you have so many good ideas about solving problems, and there's something that I've been trying to figure out, and I wonder if you'd think with me. And I'll tell you what I was thinking and what I thought might work, and I wonder if you'd give me your thoughts." Now, of course, as soon as he's relaxed, if you pounce on him with that list of 27 faults, then all is lost. But assuming that a woman can soften the startup and doesn't use frustration to drive into a conversation, then he's going to be better able to hear her. Then there's also advice for men. The advice for men is to self-soothe. Self-soothe. Or one way Gottman says it is listen past the edge in your partner's voice. Instead of taking it as some kind of insult, instead of being offended and hurt, instead of growing defensive, you say, I'll bet you she brought this up because she cares so much about our relationship, and that if I'm able to hear what she has to say, I'll bet you it'll be good for us. Now, that doesn't come naturally. That's not the way we are wired. We are, in fact, wired to protect ourselves, defend ourselves. So, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Any questions or comments before we tie it to another idea? Okay. Another thing I wanted to mention is the developmental course of relationships. You may know that half of the marriages that are going to end will end by the 7th year. Isn't that amazing? That within 7 years you can go from starstruck, love-struck companions to mortal enemies. That is quite an accomplishment. To do that, all of that in merely 7 years. It's my sense that that our culture, influenced not only by our own natural inclinations, but also by a movie-making industry that doesn't know anything about relationships, expects that the measure of healthy relationships is that there's that breathless sense of love that we often began with. The way my mentor in my doctoral program said it, he said, "Love is a feeling you feel you're going to feel when you feel you're going to feel a feeling that you never felt before." It's all this, and what biologists say is, that kind of wild emotion cannot sustain a healthy relationship. It was never intended to, and it cannot. And in fact, a little side trip. I don't know if I'm supposed to draw on that. Is that a full-fledged whiteboard or just a screen? Because there's a projector there. So I'll use saliva, which I think won't do permanent harm. When you graph relationship strength against time, what happens with romance is it goes shooting up and dropping down. It's a fairly symmetrical pattern. And when we depend on romance to sustain a relationship, we're inevitably disappointed. Now, I know it's popular to have various activities about keeping your romance alive. And if it means the same kind of romance we had when we first got together, it's a really bad idea. If by romance we mean something a little more mature, then it could be a good idea. But I'm afraid that fairly often what we mean is let's play like we haven't been fighting for the last 7 years, and play like we're back to being madly in love with each other. Now, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is that romance will not sustain a relationship. And Marcus is an engineer. You understand these graphs, don't you? You know what does work? Over time, companionship grows gradually, steadily, and continuingly. It is, in fact, companionship that will sustain a relationship over time. It's not that wild, romantic passion that got us together. In fact, sociobiologists say it does what it's supposed to do. It gets us together. But it does not have the power to keep us together. What will keep us together is companionship. And the irony, in my view, is that when we have deep, profound, lasting companionship, it still ends up feeling kind of like romance, but it's different. It's not about that silly, wild, passionate, breathless. It's just an appreciation of another person who has entrusted us with their life, happiness, and sacred fortunes. Can you imagine? When I think about the fact that Nancy has entrusted me with her soul, I think, wow, I don't deserve that trust. Not nearly. And I feel so humbled to appreciate and honor the trust she's invested in our relationship. I mean, most of us marry fairly young and are really dumb beyond our years, aren't we? And have little sense of what lies ahead. So, one of the other things I think is worth mentioning is, as normal background, is the fact that let's draw a circle, and let's imagine that in a relationship that overall we feel pretty good about 80% of our spouse, about how she looks and how she acts. I mean, we all have some little marginal irritations, but maybe about 80% of our spouse we like. So if that's our circle, then that means that this much, 80%, we feel good about. But there's always that 20% we don't feel good about, isn't there? And what Daniel Wiley, the great researcher, says is, there always is. And you can divorce the person with whom you've become intimately acquainted with their limitations and marry someone else, and you'll have a brief vacation of a few years while you find out in what ways they will make you crazy. And then you can do what Americans do, which is serial monogamy. The law only allows you to marry one person at a time, but in the course of a lifetime you expect to marry several. Because we aren't quite comfortable with the idea that there will be, in any relationship, this section, say 20% of the contents of the relationship that we don't feel very good about. 20%. Now, there's a bit of interesting news from Gottman's research. You can say, yeah, but I can fix her. Or she may say, I can fix him. I think he's trying, and I bet I can patch up his soul and make him into a decent human being. And related to that, the research says that 70% of what you don't like about your partner will never change. It's what John Gottman calls unresolvable differences. 70% of what you don't like about your partner is never going to change. Now, some of you are thinking, okay, so I only have that 30% of what I don't like to work on. That's my spousal improvement opportunity. But there's another little irony related to that. What research says is that the only way to get your partner to change, the only way to get your partner to change is by loving them the way they are. So let's think about this circle here, the contents of a relationship. There's always going to be some part, there's always going to be that 20% that we're not very crazy about. And of that, 70% of that is not going to change. We can be mad about it, we can talk about it, we can list it, we can write in our journal about it, we can grieve about it, we can be annoyed endlessly about it, or there's an alternative. By putting the focus on this stuff that we like, the 80%, then life and, hey, thanks. Life and nature gives us as a gift that 30% of the 20% that irritated us. So, in any case, my sense is that most couples take a few years to figure out how to automate their irritation. All the spouse has to say is good morning. You think, why do you always say that? I mean, don't we automate our irritation? Don't we start after a while reacting to even things that we once thought were incredibly positive? And I have a personal theory which I have discussed with John Gottman, and I asked him, I said, John, wouldn't you guess that our own personal strengths are the biggest problem in our marriages? That because we use our strengths and rely on them so heavily, and our spouse grows into our weaknesses, that the overuse of our strengths causes us a great deal of our grief. And his rather succinct answer is probably. It wasn't an extended discussion. So our strengths, and sometimes I have the what I consider a sacred opportunity to talk to couples who are struggling for a variety of different reasons. And I am amazed how all the things that brought them together start to be the primary irritations in the relationship over time. Wow. And let me use a metaphor that I like. Let's imagine that you decided to build a new house, and you had lofty ambitions and a healthy budget, and you decide to build a new house. But you're really deeply divided because you have two favorite contractors. So you tell one contractor, you start here and build half the house, and you start there and build the other half of the house. And they say, well, where are your plans? They say, I don't have any plans. Each of you just do a house the way you like to build. Each of you build your favorite style of house. Now, how well are those two halves of the house going to fit with each other? Are the halls going to line up? Will the walls and bathrooms, is it going to line up? Now, I hope the metaphor is obvious. Each of us is raised, built, developed in a different factory, a different family. And then when we try to put those two halves together, they don't fit worth a darn. And we're really mad about that because it seemed like, I'll bet you some have experienced this, when you were dating, it seemed like, wow, we have so much in common. I mean, you're at a football game and you say, would you like a hot dog? And she says, yes. Because after all, she's trying to be agreeable. She doesn't really like hot dogs. And you say, well, do you want relish on it, sweet relish? And she wants to be agreeable, but she says, I don't really like sweet relish. And he goes, oh, wow, I don't either. This must be the foundation of a great relationship. What? We overestimate our similarity when we're courting, and then as the years pass by are surprised how different we are. And what I'd like to say about those differences is, one, they're normal, they're universal. Having differences with your partner is simply a characteristic of being with another human being. The second thing that will relate to the bulk of what we talk about today is that those differences are the invitation to growth. That rather than being just tormenting, bedeviling, unfortunate reality of nature, those differences in fact create our opportunity to become something more than we were. So that instead of bringing to marriage here's how the world is supposed to operate, and then expecting my spouse to be the servant in that vision, instead of that, we negotiate over the decades our shared vision. Nancy and I, incidentally, just celebrated 41 years. So, and it just keeps getting better. So, well, one of the questions I think people are tempted to ask themselves is, are we all bad choosers? Do we choose badly in marriage? And that's why there are all these jarring discontents and the chafing along the boundaries between two sets of preferences. And my answer to that is no, it's not about being bad choosers. It's about our faulty expectations of relationships. It's about expecting this person to be custom designed to meet my needs, which is a fundamentally selfish vision of marriage. And I believe that marriage has much loftier aspirations to teach us how to be stretched in togetherness, how to accommodate each other. Some things will settle pretty quickly, like which way the toilet paper ought to come off the roll. So some of those things will probably settle, but there will be continuing struggles, and I'll bet you each of you could name something where there's a fundamental disagreement. Of course, I don't know most of you, so I can't say this is one, but for instance, the research is pretty clear that men's interest in physical intimacy is consistently higher than women's. I don't know if you've heard that story where a husband and wife separately met with a therapist, and he asked the wife, he said, so how often are you and your husband intimate? And she said, it's constant. It's 3 times a week. Later, the therapist interviewed the husband, who said, so how often are you two intimate? And he said, never. Only about 3 times a week. So the way we value things, and that's only one example, but ladies, if your husband has greater interest than you, it's not because he's weird. It's because he's a guy. And that is one of the great opportunities for some negotiation, isn't it? So the heart of what we'll talk about this morning is a whole new approach to couple relationships. It doesn't ignore or contradict what John Gottman has taught, but this 12-page workbook is something that's literally hot off the presses. We had to have this drop shipped from Fayetteville to Little Rock so that I could bring it with me. So you're the first people in the universe to see this new program. You may think, well, that's good or it's bad, depending on how you feel about the program. We'll see. We'd like to share this with you. Andy, should we spread some around? And I want to talk about, the title is Getting Our Hearts Right, 3 Keys to Better Relationships. Getting our hearts right. And as we go along, we'll talk more about what we mean by that and what the implications are. But I brought 110, I think, 105, something like that.
Let's start with 1 per person.
Or couple? Is that what you mean? I don't know how many, have you counted? I thought you meant 1 per couple,
Okay.
but
Let's start 1 per couple. If we have more, we'll distribute those 2.
and then afterwards you can come up and say, I need to get my spouse's heart right, give me 2 or 3 extras.
For those of you who are watching online, this is available as a download at sharedotera.com, and then click on downloads.
Wow.
So go to sharedotera.com/downloads, and it's the top link. It's not for you, it's for the online crowd.
This program is available as a PDF online. And Andy mentioned Shared Otera. It'll also be posted on our website at University of Arkansas Extension Service. And that website is on the print material you have, and we'll gladly share that. So we take the attitude that we don't own any knowledge, but that any knowledge we have, we should share. And so, as I said, the PDF of this is fully available to all of you. And I mean, you can order print copies, but we, as the university, have to charge for the printed copies. So you could print your own or order them at is essentially a cost recovery price, either way. Let's give just a little bit of history about this program. About 3 years ago, I was asked to do a conference presentation at the National Council on Family Relations. And they gave me like 3 hours on the program, which is an extraordinary thing that they will trust you with that much time. And they asked me to make a presentation. I talked about what I'd been discovering in the last few years of looking at the research. And what I'd been discovering is that humans are incredibly illogical thinkers, that we are badly and consistently biased in the way we perceive and process our perceptions of the world around us. That seemed to be the consistent message of what I read. So over time that evolved. We started thinking, wow, the evidence is abundant. The evidence is clear. We all think we're very objective, and not one of us is. And that creates a great deal of the struggle we have in relationships, is that we believe that we have a privileged view of truth. So over time, we gathered up the research and wondered what to do, and we started writing a program for the last 2 years. We have written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten this program more times than all our other programs put together, because it happens to be a somewhat complicated idea, and we'd like to make it practical and useful. And we'll see whether when we're finished today you feel like we succeeded or did not. I believe that in either case you'll find some useful ideas along the way. So as I said, it's been 3 years in evolution. We tried at one point to shorten it down to 4 pages to make it really simple and practical, but it lost too much of the content. It's been as high as 20 pages. It's now ended up at 12 pages. And let's talk about some of the ideas and see if they make sense to you. The first, in fact, and you're welcome to follow along. Notice the first head there under the title is Conflict is a Universal Human Problem. Conflict is a universal human problem. So, years ago, I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I actually had some 16mm film equipment, and I started making movies, and I read a book on script writing, and it said something that quite surprised me. It said there has never been a story where conflict was not at the core. And you start thinking about it, Cain and Abel. Any conflict there? How about Elizabeth Taylor and her husbands? Any conflict there? How about Lindsay Lohan and everyone in the universe? Poor kid, she's kind of crosswise of the world, isn't she? Or how about Moses and Pharaoh? Or at least what this script writing book rather boldly claimed is, there never was a meaningful story, certainly not a movie story, where conflict was not the core of it. So should we be surprised when conflict is at the core of couple relationship? Should we feel cheated? Or should we say, yeah, this is my opportunity for growth? Conflict, that is, differences of opinion, different approaches, different values, different beliefs. It's at the heart of all relationships. I'm guessing that just this morning, It's rare that, for instance, in getting up on a Saturday morning and trying to get here at 9 a.m., was there any conflict around your house about one of you being more punctual than the other? No? Some of you are smiling and you don't have to raise your hand, but conflict is pretty nearly universal, isn't it? So there are two things I think that we usually do when we have a relationship problem, two things that are our common problem-solving responses. One is to seek greater, there we go, seek greater knowledge and develop new skills. And I believe nowhere is this more true than in various couples education programs, where very commonly when people have relationship troubles, we may sign them up for what is America's most popular marriage program, which is PrEP, and it'll teach people how to express their concerns without being defensive. And and it uses something called the floor technique, where you have this little printed piece of cardboard that looks like a linoleum floor, and whoever holds that has the floor and is able to say whatever they want about concerns or frustrations. And the other person can only ask clarifying questions and may not defend or argue or whatever. Now, I don't know if some of you think that's as amusing as I do, because when we're mad, are we fair with the floor? We'll hold it and say, I'm never giving this floor to you, you lowlife. I mean, you know. And you can imagine that when the floor maybe does pass to a partner, that person in like manner then says, well, I've got a few things I'd like to say. So, that is literally the centerpiece of America's most popular marriage program. And the research says it doesn't work. That when people feel attacked, they are not able to do the emotional gymnastics necessary to respond in those ways. It doesn't work. That's the consistent message of John Gottman's research. And so you can take the workshop if it makes you feel better. They may have good refreshments. You can learn the floor technique. But the message of research is that when people feel attacked, they feel undervalued, they feel any of those negative emotions, the ability to sustain a discussion just disappears. So we often teach, as I said, knowledge and skills. We teach people a lot of stuff like we did at the beginning. We talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and encourage men to self-soothe and women to soften the startup. That's knowledge, and it can be skills when we're practiced at it and good at it, so that when we feel attacked, we, instead of reacting, can say, wow, dear, I want to think about that some. I mean, I've always thought, try to picture that your spouse says to you, honey, I think you're a low-life piece of dirt, and I don't find anything interesting or attractive about you. And we're supposed to say, honey, thank you for sharing that. I know that took a lot of courage, and I really appreciate that the person who I have invested the most in feels so negatively about me. I mean, one of my side points, I guess, is this, that there are a lot of things we do that sound like they make sense. And they don't. They don't work. And we'll talk about some more of those in a few minutes. There are a lot of things that sound reasonable and rational and even become, as I said, the centerpieces of America's couple relationship programs, but do not enjoy the support of research. So, speaker-listener techniques or floor technique. It turns out that conflict swamps knowledge and skills. So even if we ask experts, attend programs, read books, get advice, we attend classes, all those things are fairly unlikely to change our relationship, because when there's conflict, we're all overwhelmed. We are, the word that's popularly used in psychology is we are all flooded when we feel attacked. When we feel like somebody is diminishing us or our value, we get emotionally flooded. And it's not a very good place for sensible thinking or rational discussion. So we have on page 3 of this workbook, you'll see a pair of glasses there. A pair of glasses that are pretty muddy. And our message is we all see through glasses darkly. We all have mud-spattered, scratch-damaged lenses. And none of us really sees the whole story. And I'd like to give some more specific examples of that. But I might also mention that when Jonathan Haidt, who I think is one of our most brilliant psychologists, when Jonathan Haidt decided to teach about this principle, and I should tell you that he's a secular humanist. He's an atheist, and when he writes about it, he said the best metaphor that's ever been created to understand this is one that was used a long time ago about a mote and a beam. And it's the one he chooses to use, even though he's not remotely religious. He talks about each of us looks for the slivers in other people's eyes. We're saying, oh, yeah, I could probably get that out. Eye and all. And we're quite unaware of the 4 by 6 inch beam that fills our own eyes. So I think that familiar metaphor is one that's pretty apt. So in relationships, when we see imperfectly, when we misunderstand each other, and then especially when we think we understand each other while not, relationships get complicated. So let's talk about some of the examples. Notice in that list of biases there on page 3, we've come up with about 10, but we summarized it with about 7 biases. And we'll talk about each of these for a few minutes and see if they make sense to you. The first one you see listed there is egocentrism. Egocentrism. I love the historical antecedent for this. Think about way back before, say, 1500, when people assumed that that everything rotated around the Earth. That our see, you can't say solar system because that is the modern understanding, but the system of planets all rotated around the Earth, and there was a guy named Tycho Brahe who was an astronomer who could even calculate. Now, of course, you have planets doing weird things like going forward and then going backwards for a while, and then going forward and then backwards, because when you try to have everything going around the Earth, you can create the equations, but they sure are complicated. About 1543, we have Copernicus saying, gee, that's just wrong. We all orbit around the sun. So it created a heliocentric system instead of a geocentric, sun-centered instead of earth-centered. Do you think that might have a metaphor for couple relationships? Do you think that when we think of our relationship in terms of how we want it to focus on me and my needs and advancing my purposes, that somehow, yeah, you can create a logic that seems to make sense, but ultimately it gets really complicated and it's not very efficient. It's not, as scientists like to say, it's not elegant. It's complex and messy. In contrast, when we find some other object on which our relationships center, and I'll let you decide what that ought to be. Is it on growth? Is it on service? Is it on God? Is it on, I mean, you decide what, in your view, is the thing around which all relationships should orbit. And when we start to orbit around some common cause, some joint purpose, then things go much better than when we try to create an earth-centered or a self-centered marriage. Clearly, I mean, stonewalling, I think, is one example of this. In stonewalling, when a guy thinks he's being noble while marching away and leaving his wife feeling desolate, is one example of a guy thinking he's being noble but not being. Lawrence Peters, you know the Peters principle, he says, rare is the person who can weigh the faults of others without putting his thumb on the scale. That when we tend to weigh the faults of others, we always tend to do it in self-serving ways. That is, we evaluate their misdeeds and misbehavior based on how their acts and thoughts and lives affect us. As if, again, we were at the center of the universe. Egocentrism is such an interesting problem. Are babies born entirely unselfish? I mean, when a baby, Abby, we could ask you, you know, when Lincoln is born, did he come out and say, wow, I can see you guys have been stressed. How about if you guys just take a break, set me aside, come back to me in a couple hours or a couple days. I'll be fine. You guys just get a little rest and a nice snack. Is that what babies say? No. A baby comes into the world saying, I don't care what you've been through. I'm going to torture you till you take care of me. I don't care that you just went in the valley of the shadow of death. I don't care that for 24 or however many hours you've been in labor. I'm going to scream and holler and torture you in one of the most efficient ways ever invented until you minister to me. Now, I think you get the point. If we're still taking that attitude when we're married some 20, 30, or 40 years later, it isn't evidence of very much progress. So, I want to add to this, to egocentrism. George Bernard Shaw said, humans are a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making them happy. That sounds like egocentrism, doesn't it? Don't we imagine that husband and wife come home from hard days of work, and each of us half expects our partner to minister to us in our recovery, and are quite irritated when our spouse thinks that they should have some time to recover as well. One of my favorite expressions of this is something that Tom Ryan is reported to have said. Reportedly, he said, I was polishing my trophies the other day, and I happened to catch my reflection, and gee, it's easy to see why women are crazy about me. Do you think Tom Ryan would be a fun guy to be married to? I mean, there's egocentrism at its best, I'd say. Any comment or question about egocentrism as one of the biases that keeps us from seeing each other accurately? Do you believe that it's possible that we tend to evaluate our partners and their behavior through the lens of our own needs and preferences? We tend to impose our way on this person who brings a rich and different way of doing life, and we tend to find them wanting. So let's talk about the second one, called fundamental attribution bias. Fundamental attribution bias. It says essentially that we all make mistakes and faults, and we excuse ours because of our circumstances, but when others do the same thing, we blame it on their faulty character. So for instance, when in traffic you cut in front of someone, it's because you're in a hurry, you're under pressure, you've got to get there and take care of this, that, or the other, right? But when your spouse does it, my spouse is a crazy woman. That's fundamental attribution bias. And just a side note, this is very well attested in human experience. That is, research shows consistently that we as humans tend to excuse ourselves while blaming others for doing the same things we do. Or, for instance, how about a messy desk? If my desk is messy, it's because I have so many projects. If Nancy's desk is messy, she's just not organized. Anybody relate to that? I mean, you can name any area of irritation, and the tendency is for us to see shortcomings and faults in others while failing to see them in ourselves. Another example, I think, is related to this. It takes an extreme form. An extreme form of fundamental attribution bias is something that psychologists call the myth of pure evil. It's one that we dropped from our list because it has some overlap with this fundamental attribution bias, the myth of pure evil. What it basically says is once we've decided who's right and who's wrong, we give the us's way too much credit while giving the them's far too little credit. And that applies between husband and wife. It applies between Baptists and Presbyterians. It happens between Republicans and Democrats. I want to say that again. It happens between Republicans and Democrats. And the reason I say it is because I think we've just been through a pretty contentious political season. And I happen to agree with Jonathan Haidt, who says, if you want wisdom, there's a surprising place you'll find it. It's by listening to the thoughts of your opponent, your enemy. That's where you'll find wisdom. Now, it doesn't mean that they're more right than you are. But when we understand, and in fact he makes a very strong case, a very strong secular liberal, he says, when we as a society fail to listen to conservatives, we do so at our own peril. Because conservatives have always gotten part of the story far more right than the liberals have, and vice versa. And we tend to, as humans and as Americans, and as Utahns, and whatever category you want to put yourself in, we tend to divide the world into us's and them's. Then, attributing far too much goodness, wisdom, insight to the us's, and giving far too little credit to the them's, those with whom we disagree. Can you see that operating in couple relationships? Sometimes we look at our spouse and say, wow, maybe this person could have a prefrontal lobotomy and then just learn to believe what I believe, and they'd be so much better off because they're so dull. Well, I believe that marriage is designed to challenge us, to stretch us, to force us to think about those kind of things. And if you're interested, the brilliant book on this subject is one by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, called Happiness Hypothesis. He's also done one called The Righteous Mind, and it has nothing to do with religion, really. It has to do with how in religion and politics we tend to give ourselves way too much credit, and we tend to listen to those who differ from us far too little. The first book was Happiness Hypothesis. And I think it's brilliant. Now, just a side note, if some of you are interested, when I read a book, I highlight what I think are the most powerful statements, and then one of my coworkers types all those in a file. So if you want the short version of his book, you can email me, and I'll send you the short file of great quotes. You could also sign up for our weekly emails where we take quotes from great thinkers, and every week we send them out in the area of personal well-being, couple relationships, and parenting. And they're all, of course, free. Where do you sign up? Let's put right here. So AR Families, AR for Arkansas, arkansasfamilies.org. And one of the things you have to click on, our navigation isn't as efficient as it used to be, as it should be, but you click on Family Life, which is the area of our programs. We also have nutrition, money management, and other programs, but if you click on Family Life, then one of the options will be navigating life's journey. And that's where you sign up for the free emails if you're interested. And we deliberately and consistently keep them short so that, don't we hate those meandering emails? So they're short, usually a few words of a great quote and then a little bit of commentary on it. So the first bias is egocentrism, then fundamental attribution bias. Let's talk about naive realism. This is one of my personal favorites. I feel like I've pretty much perfected it. In naive realism, we tend to see bias and bad logic in other people, but fail to see it in ourselves. Let me read you a quote from Jonathan Haidt. He says, "Each of us thinks we see the world directly as it really is. We think we see things accurately. We further believe that the facts are there for anyone to see. Therefore, other people should agree with us. If they were rational, people should agree with us. If they don't agree, it follows either that they have not been exposed to the relevant facts, or else they're blinded by bias, by ideologies, by prejudice. It just seems plain as day to the naive realist that everyone is influenced by ideology and self-interest. Except for me. I see things as they really are." Again, a bias well established in human thinking, that we have a tendency to believe that we're the ones who get it. We understand what's what. And as a result, we have a hard time hearing other people's opinions, views, preferences. Haidt talks about this problem of naive realism being the biggest obstacle to world peace. I don't know if you've ever sat between an ardent Zionist and a Palestinian. I do not recommend it. I have been surprised that among my dear friends are people of both persuasions. And it is amazing how unable people with strong emotions are to hear each other and understand each other. I don't know if some of you know Brian Barber. He's a professor of family, and he spent a lot of time with Palestinian youth, because he studied youth, especially how they cope with war. So he lived with Palestinian young people in the Gaza Strip, and he came home and gave a presentation, which I went to because I like Brian, and he changed my life. Because he said, for instance, that the commonest question he got from Palestinian young people was, "Why do you Americans hate us? Why do you hate us?" Now, I don't want what I'm saying to be understood as saying that the Palestinians are right and the Zionists are wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that when people get so divided and so angry about any issue, it becomes impossible for them to learn from each other and find solutions. And I believe we're seeing that every day in the news today. And even closer to home, I think we see it in national elections, where we tend to become true believers in one dogma or another. So I guess that might feel a little bit like an editorial. All I would say is maybe listening to each other is something that would make us more humble, more teachable, more effective at having a broader view of the world. So let's talk about the next area. If we're progressing on parallel paths, I think you'll see where it says, anger narrows and blinds us. It closes our minds to the broad picture and shuts down our compassion for others. Anger. And some of you would know, and some of you, most of you, I'm guessing, don't know, that for years and years, Americans have had a romance with anger, believing somehow that it's this wonderful force that energizes righteous action. And the fact is that the research could be summarized in 2 words. The title of the book by Redford Williams. Redford, one of the researchers in the area, wrote a book called Anger Kills. Anger kills. That's what research says. Anger kills. It kills relationships. It, in some cases, kills people. Anger kills. And he has 17 strategies for overcoming the hostility that can ruin our health in his book, Anger Kills. Yet, as Americans, isn't it still popular in Hollywood for there to be a movie where children are underperforming on an athletic team or a band or something, and then the coach or music teacher gets really irritated and just really reams them out, and suddenly they all start taking it seriously and they win the state championship, and we go, wow, that was really cool, and we go home inspired that anger has a wonderful transformative power. And the research tells us that that is a popular but cultural lie. It's popular to believe that anger energizes, but one way to think about it is when someone's angry with you and telling you you're a dirty, low-life, scumbag, scoundrel, no good piece of dirt, you say, wow, honey, you're really making me think. Thank you for that. No, that's not how anger works. Now, is anger adaptive? And I'd say if you're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, then anger could be extremely useful. But my experience is that saber-toothed tigers are on the wane. There just aren't that many around anymore. And so our once adaptive tendency towards very strong action is less useful than it once was. So, anger. This is one of my all-time favorite anger quotes. It's by a guy named Buechner, Frederick Buechner, a brilliant guy. He says, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, and to roll your tongue over the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come. To savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you're given and the pain you're giving back. In many ways, it's a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you're wolfing down at the feast is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. So, probably in the time we have together, any of you who are deep and enduring advocates of anger as an energizing force will not be convinced in our short discussion of that, but I encourage you to be open to that possibility. There's also a book by Lerner, The Dance of Anger. There are several books now that are uniform. In fact, we used to say that type A personalities were more likely to have heart disease. Turns out that there was a confound. It isn't type A. It's not people who are high energy. Otherwise, Andy and Natalie would already be dead. It's hostility and cynicism. Those are the words that come from the research. It's hostility. Those who, having gotten mad about somebody who cut into traffic, are still mad a week later. And cynicism. Those who start thinking about their genealogy and start placing various, subspecies in the genealogy of the person who cut in traffic. And so it's hostility and cynicism that kill us. It's not type A. You can be intense, you can be a go-getter, and that's all good. But being angry is not. There are a couple other quotes. Let me summarize the one by Sigsgaard. He's a child development researcher, and he said, think about what it's like for a child when mom starts to read him the riot act. Because mom is causing extreme psychic distress, and the person to whom he normally turns for comfort when he's distressed is mom. And mom's not available for soothing, for love, for support. Think how frustrating that is for children when our reaction is over the top. Now, I don't know if sometime your group wants to talk about parenting, because there's a brand new book out called Authoritative Parenting that talks about taking some strong and clear action. Letting kids know that you mean what you say is terribly important. But the manifestations of anger are usually very disruptive to learning and communication. One other quote, this is Tavris and Aronson. By the time a couple's style of argument has escalated into shaming and blaming each other, the very purpose of their quarrel has shifted. It's no longer an effort to solve a problem or even to get the other person to modify his or her behavior. It is to wound, to insult, to score, to land a blow. Wow. So I like the saying that anger is like drinking poison waiting for your enemy to die. I mean, how long do you have to wait for your enemy to die after you've drunk poison? It could be a while, huh? And so, let's take, I think do we have 2 more biases, or do we have 3? Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias says we tend to accept only information that supports what we already believe. And the way Gardner writes about this, he says, once we have formed a view, we embrace information. We welcome information that supports that view while ignoring, rejecting, or harshly scrutinizing information that casts doubt on our beliefs. So we become ever more convinced we're right as we become very selective in our welcoming of information. So, as I said, whether the issue is religion, politics, or family battles, or any other arena of truth, when we're looking for information that proves we're right, we're not going to be growing. Sometimes we'd rather be right than be good, which to me seems like a really important distinction. That being right is a pretty shallow victory when we have hurt the people we love and we're lonely. So let's talk about unreliable memories. Gardner says most people think memory is like a camera that captures images and stores them for future retrieval. But memories routinely fade, vanish, or transform, sometimes dramatically. The mind can even fabricate memories. And some here are saying, yeah, I've seen people do that. My brother does it. My mom does it. The fact is, we all do it. In fact, do you ever go to a family reunion and you tell a story and someone else says, that's not what happened, I remember it. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. And they tell their version, you say, that is crazy. I can see it now, and that's not what happened. And we don't realize that each of us has a tendency to backfill our stories with new details, new ideas, new perspectives as we gain more information. We modify our memories over time. Now that's incredibly good news or bad news, depending on how you choose to use it. It's good news if you've had painful experiences that need some healing, because the research is clear that there is no necessary connection between bad childhoods and bad adulthoods. There is no necessary connection. You can have a rotten, stinking, no good, very bad childhood, and you don't have to move to Australia. Well, you could, huh, Andy? But you don't have to. It's a choice. Like Alexander, in the horrible, no good, very bad day. There is no necessary connection between bad experiences and our adult lives. That is the profound finding of psychology. And yet, often we allow those experiences to continue to define us and define our relationships. And we see everything through the filter of distrust, abuse, unkindness, self-serving, etc. And the net effect is destructive. Here's another of my favorite quotes by Tavris and Aronson. They say, follow this closely. This is a great statement. They say, between the conscious lie to fool ourselves and the unconscious self-justification to fool ourselves, I'm sorry, I said that first part wrong. Between the conscious lie to fool others and the unconscious self-justification to fool ourselves lies a fascinating gray area patrolled by that unreliable, self-serving historian, memory. Memories are often pruned and shaped by an ego-enhancing bias that blurs the edges of past events, softens responsibility, and distorts what really happened. Over time, as the self-serving distortions of memory kick in, and we forget or distort past events, we may come to believe our own lies, little by little by little. So we Photoshop our histories. And there's a great book that talks about finding the defining stories in your life, which are the inherently positive ones that define everything that's sweet and joyous, and then having those as clearly the driving, defining mental images of what life is about, instead of the contrary, which is look for the bad and see it everywhere. So, unreliable memories, negativity bias. I think that's our final bias, isn't it? On this list, negativity bias. It says that negative events are much stronger in our minds and memories than positive events. Let me tie this to some parenting research that I think is fascinating. The research says that little children believe they're responsible for their mother's anger and sadness, but not her happiness. Isn't that sad? Can you see why? See, sometimes when we're happy, we're looking out the kitchen window, seeing our kids playing and being just cute and charming. We just think, oh, that's so neat. And we say nothing to them. But when we're angry, do they hear about it? Do they get a pretty nearly endless lecture about misdeeds and responsibility and whatever? Well, the same principle applies, that we tend to be overwhelmed by bad things. They tend to fill our minds and memories. And some psychologists have said this is very adaptive, because if you're going to survive, you have to notice when you're attacked by saber-toothed tigers or mastodons or University of Utah Utes or whatever it is. You need to notice so you can respond. We like the Utes, don't we, Marcus? Yeah. You can see how that negativity bias could operate. Like, for instance, on your way to a party to gather with dear friends, you might have a fender bender, and you take care of the accident report and get to the party. What will you be thinking about for the next day or two? Is it that wonderful party? Or is it the fender bender? Research suggests that negativity tends to be stronger than positivity. We tend to remember negative events. We tend to over-privilege them in our minds and our hearts. So, I don't know if any of you are yet convinced that bias is a part of the human inheritance, that it's a serious problem and it has real consequences in couple relationships. I hope you believe that. And I hope that having this workbook to take with you will help you revisit that and think about how they operate. And what I'd like to do is talk about two very specific actions that research says will help us overcome bias. Two very specific and, in some ways, surprising recommendations that will help us deal with bias. But it seems like people should have a chance to go to the restroom, doesn't it? Should we, Andy, take 10, 15? What do we need to do? 10 minutes, okay. So about 10:40, should we be back and we'll surge forward?
So before my dad gets started again, I want to create a space for each of us to go ahead and fill in, just kind of start journaling about some of the breakthroughs you're having personally, about some of your own personal biases. So go ahead and take a few minutes and just go ahead and fill in, what breakthroughs you're having, what thoughts, what insights, which ahas have you had so far, as you think about your relationship and just some of your thinking. Settle down now and we have our seats so that we can get our time together and we can take care of any orders or questions when we're through. So turn the time back to Dr. Walter.
Thanks, Eddie. You're more than kind. Thank you. I just think I ought to make a little disclaimer. A year ago, after treatments failed, I had cancer surgery, and I have continued to not be quite sure how my body was going to react, and I'm struggling with some weakness, and my body didn't really like the surgery, and so maybe you'll forgive me if sometimes I'm dragging just a little bit, but hopefully we can still make the points that ought to be made. And you've got audio back there? Okay, great. Now, Andy suggested that we maybe use the spaces. You notice we created areas for reflection. And the intent is that those are a place to, if your spouse makes you crazy in one way or another, you may not want to sit there with your spouse and write that out. But you might want to make a mental note or two, or you might want to think about another relationship. I believe that the stuff we're talking about can be effective for the most challenging relationships because it doesn't just use knowledge and skills. It uses a different way of thinking, a new, shall we say, change of heart. So as we go along, you will see the places there are to write in a reflection box and think about various challenges, and I encourage you to do that. And Andy, if you see a place where we're kind of missing a chance, you shout out, will you, please? Thanks. There are two things that are surprising in the treatment of bias, and they're not what most people suspect. Generally, if we think we're going to treat bias, that what we ought to do is have people write an essay or give a talk in favor of the opposing viewpoint. Turns out that doesn't work. That even as people write that essay or give that talk, they're thinking, what a crock. I don't understand how anyone would believe that. There is something that's effective. It's actually two parts that are effective in helping us deal with the bias that keeps us from seeing each other accurately. The first one is Well, tell you what, let me set the stage for those two with a story. Years ago, Nancy and I lived in Vernal, Utah, and we had some friends who had very stressful lives. They had several children, and the husband had his own business. The wife had her own crafts business, and so the two of them were very, very busy. And there was an era in which the husband would come home, and his name was Gene. Gene would come home, and he would look around the house and say, "Sylvia, how come the chores aren't done? How come the kids haven't done their chores? I mean, what you been doing?" Or, "How come the kids haven't done their homework?" Or, "How come dinner isn't ready?" Or, he being perhaps tired and stressed after a day at work, would come home with his complaints. And this went on for some time with him saying, "Sylvia, why haven't you done this or that or the other?" And finally the time came when Sylvia had had quite enough. And she said, "Gene, you have faults too." And he said, "I know, but they don't bother me like yours do." Now, for me, that's one of my all-time favorite stories because it captures the human condition. It captures that reality that there's a tendency for us to let other people's shortcomings irritate us while forgiving our own. That's really that fundamental attribution bias, isn't it? Now, there is a little exception that should be noted in this context. The exception is that women tend to be better at self-blame than men are. So, ladies, you want to give yourself a round of applause? It is why, according to Seligman, women are twice as likely as men in adulthood to be depressed. Now, in childhood, that's not true. In childhood, boys are more likely than girls to be depressed because, after all, boys were not designed to get along in school, where kicking people in the shins and knocking people down is not highly valued. But in adulthood and for the rest of the lifespan, women are twice as likely as men to be depressed. And presumably it's because, as women, you may be really good at finding fault with yourself. And there are actually any number of ways in which a person could go astray in trying to apply these principles. One of them would be for a woman to say, "Well, I'm an idiot and mistaken," and et cetera, et cetera. That's not productive. It is productive, probably, to say, "I never see the whole story. At the best, I only see a tiny fraction of reality." So, when we talk about how to deal with bias, the first step, according to research, is for us to study bias. The thing that helps people to overcome bias is to be aware of bias. That's why we took as long as we did in this program, and as long as we have in our time together this morning, to talk about bias, in the hope that you might really believe that for you as well as the rest of the human race, that misunderstanding other people is an enduring problem. Now, if we asked each of you to pull out your iPhones or whatever device you have, and maybe you play some music that really is the soundtrack of your life, and you know this song? Let's see. Great song, isn't it? Izzy Kalkalale. Now, if we had everybody get out their musical device and each person here played their favorite song, what's the result? Ah! Thank you, Andy. I think he's got a louder device than I do. Oh, okay. Let's see. Somehow now I have to get Izzy slowed down. Izzy, you ready to stop? Thank you. I think the... Okay, who is that? Who's related to Andy Williams? Okay, that was melodious. We all in our lives tend to be playing the soundtrack that we have built up over the years. We are playing the story that we have built up over time. And as a result, it's sometimes really, really hard for us to tap our toe and dance the music of someone else's life because we're listening to our music. So, when there are two things I said make a real difference in overcoming bias. The first is recognize that bias is universal. We all have it. We all struggle with it. That's the first. The second is, rather than write something in favor of what your adversary believes, what does work is for... That sounds like a train wreck. Okay, AC/DC, train wreck. So the second part is to find the errors in our own thinking, or at least go looking for them. To go looking in our own assumptions, our own biases, our own way of organizing the world. And that, according to research, does work. When we study bias, which we've certainly done this morning, and then we think about, reflect upon, and organize our thoughts around our imperfect thinking. And some of us can see that pretty clearly. Like, for instance, if you take a personality test, Nancy and I are polar opposites on 3 out of 4 scales of the Myers-Briggs personality test. And so, you know, I'm the extrovert who feels like, hey, do you have Andy's address? Let's have a party after this. And Nancy's the person who would like to find a quiet place with little Abby and just hold Abby and kiss her face. And now, Nancy likes people every bit as much as I do. But she gains energy from time alone. I gain energy from being with people. Though that's the difference between an extrovert and an introvert. And we tend to believe that our way of doing things is somehow more righteous, more holy, more wise, more sensible, more correct. And we tend to expect our friends, partners, family members to act the way we act. Well, do some of you, I'll bet some of you have read some of Steve Covey's books. One of my favorite stories is about the Frigidaire. Do you remember that story? About as they decided they need a new refrigerator, that what Steve did, not surprisingly, is pull out Consumer Reports and look up the ratings of various refrigerators, looked at reliability, etc., and cost. He also looked at availability and came up with 2 or 3 suggestions. And Sandra resisted all of his suggestions and said, Steve, I like Frigidaires. And sometimes guys have this unfortunate tendency to think, wow, you don't really think, do you? I mean, that's just silly and irrational. Just a side note, the research shows that one of the best things men can do is, here's the phrase from John Gottman, accept influence from their wives. Accept influence. In other words, take seriously the things they think and feel, believe, and say. Accept influence. When we filter everything through our own screen of rationality, what we're really saying is your opinion is different from mine, so therefore it's inferior. In contrast, when we accept influence, when we really listen to each other and try to understand each other, there's a possibility for finding a solution. So Sandra and Steve were at odds about buying a refrigerator, and they continued the discussion, and according to Steve, it was sometime later that they were on the beach in California. Now, intriguingly, Steve tells the story as if he being a great husband was just investing time in their marriage. But Sandra tells the story that he'd been riding the motorcycle on the beach, which was illegal, and he was hiding from the police. So I leave it to you to decide which is more plausible. We do have a tendency to reform those memories, don't we? So they are talking in a fairly casual way, and Sandra starts to tell Steve a story. She says, Steve, when I was a little girl, my dad was having a hard time supporting our family and feeding us. There just wasn't enough money to make ends meet. We were always short, and so Dad, who was a school teacher, decided that he would open an appliance business. So he began an appliance business, and she said in the evenings he would sometimes say, hey kids, I want to tell you how grateful I am to Frigidaire. because all the other appliance dealers would require cash in advance for their deliveries. But Frigidaire would allow cash when things were sold. They would send appliances, and then Sandra's dad could pay when they got paid for them. And so, intriguingly, Sandra didn't remember that when they were having the discussions about appliances. It was only later, when they were peaceful and non-defensive, when they were chatting with each other and, shall we say, trying to understand each other. Then, and only then, could he hear what really mattered to Sandra. And I bet you know what kind of refrigerator they got. It was a Frigidaire. Because Sandra not only remembered, but she felt what her father had said, and it still left an emotional imprint on her. Well, so overcoming bias requires, we say, 3 skills that we find in the research. That ability to set aside our own biases and see the faults in our own story might be something akin to humility. So key number 1 is humility. And if you're, let's see where that starts in the booklet. So you might have that handy. Page 5. Okay. So humility opens our hearts. When Steve Covey could set aside his Consumer Reports and listen to Sandra, he could have a revelation, a new discovery about why something mattered to Sandra. Let me give you another example. There's a story told about when Abraham Lincoln was president. And one day he was standing outside the White House talking to a legislator. They were having a really informative discussion when Mary Todd Lincoln came trotting out of the White House and started castigating Abe. Started telling him what an idiot he was and how he did things all wrong, and just went on and on. You know how when we're angry, we just can't say enough that's bad, can we? We just go on, and she did. And after a while, she returned to the White House, and Abe reacted in an interesting way. In fact, the legislator was wondering, wow, how will the President of the United States react when he's dressed down that way? And what he said to the man was, those explosions make Mary feel so good that I'm thinking I'll just let her keep doing it. Now, what we know about anger is that it's probably not very good for her and it's not good for him. But notice that he was man enough to, instead of bristling and saying, "You're not being fair, you're falsely accusing me, you don't understand me," instead of that, he just understood what someday maybe we'll understand better, that Mary Todd Lincoln had some mental health problems that kept her from making some decisions that she might have made if she had been healthier. And so Abe, who maybe understood that, just said, "It makes her feel good, and I can take it. I can take it." So that's not a bad definition, I think, of humility. And let me give you another story. This one in the parenting arena. Nancy and I were invited to speak and do a training at a conference in North Carolina. It's called the Children, Youth, and Families at Risk Conference. And so we'd been flown in a day before the conference began, and then we're to do I can't remember if it was a 1-day or a 2-day workshop on parenting. And having some time, and it being a beautiful day in North Carolina in the spring of the year, we took the bag of pretzels we had. It's those, real thick, chunky pretzels that I think are really animal feed. And we sat on a bench and would start throwing out the pretzels for the ducks that were in abundance. There were lots and lots of ducks at this little lake near the conference hotel. Of course, lots of tourists and lots of food for the ducks. So we sat there feeding the ducks, and then a little boy who was running up ahead of his mother. Mom was behind with a baby in a stroller. Little boy came running up, and he was fascinated by those ducks. So he came running, lunging at the ducks. How did the ducks like that? Did they think, well, developmentally that's about right for a kid that age? Is that what the ducks said? No, the ducks they squawked and flapped and flew off. And so when the boy turned around and started coming back past me, I'd have to say I'm not proud of this, but I looked him in the eyes and I said, do not chase the ducks. We have ways of saying things that let kids know that they could be in danger of physical harm if they disregard our counsel, don't we? And my dear Nancy, she's too sweet to note the irony that I'm about to do a parenting workshop for a day or two. Instead, she nudged me and said, Wally, I wonder if he'd like to feed the ducks. And I thought, well, but he's got to suffer first because he did something I didn't like. Isn't that our mindset, that when people do things that irritate us, we want to make sure they pay? We see ourselves as the harbingers of revenge who make people pay for their mistakes. And unfortunately, Nancy's argument was so persuasive that I turned to the boy and I said, hey, would you like to come and feed the ducks? And it was like, I mean, he was delighted. So I had him stand right in front of me, and I would break up those great big old pretzels and hold them out, and he'd take some and throw them. And then he'd say, oh, I want the ducks closer. And I say, okay, throw the pretzel closer. Don't throw it so far out there. And pretty soon he was surrounded by ducks, and he was in heaven. I still thought he ought to suffer, but... Does it make sense that humility is the willingness to act in the best interest of another person instead of taking upon ourselves the role of avenger? There is deep-seated in our American story the idea that vengeance must be done. And it's my opinion that we humans aren't very good at managing revenge. That's better left to somebody who's wiser and more loving and more powerful than any of us. So rather than become agents for revenge, a better strategy is to become helpers. See, he wasn't following my unspoken rules, but instead of correction, I could make what I call invitation. I could help him figure out how to do what it is that he wants to do. One of our family mottos is, it's our job as parents to help our children get what they want in a way that we feel good about. That summarizes most of what we know about parenting. It's our job to help our children get what they want in a way that we feel good about, within the bounds set by wise and loving parents. And so sometimes the child may grab for something that's not acceptable, and we offer alternatives. Or there are many stories we could talk about that subject, but suffice it to say that humility is when, instead of trying to impose our will on the universe, we work with other people and accept their preferences. So, some of you may have read the writer Carol Lynn Pearson. She's written some neat things, and she says this that I think relates to bias. She says, I can remember many occasions when my perception has crumbled and a glimpse inside has wiped away judgment. During my college years, I looked at a fellow student whom I will call Roy in amazement. Where did he get such a gigantic ego? His need to be recognized and praised was never ending. Every conversation he had with anyone always centered on his recent triumphs, on the projects he was now involved in that would ensure his fame. He was underappreciated, he didn't let everyone know it. His name became a joke. We had him pegged as an obnoxious egomaniac who blew his own horn from morning until night. One day, I discovered that one of my friends knew his family. She began to tell me some things. Roy's father was an alcoholic. Did you know that? No, I didn't, she said. Oh, yeah. He made their lives just miserable. He was a crazy man. Once, when Roy was about 5, he walked in the kitchen and saw his father attempting to kill his mother. It was a terrible scene. And Roy was there to watch it all. And then Carolyn says this: the tremor was instant. All my perceptions, all my judgments were shattered. And I saw past the facade into the reality. I saw past the obnoxious adult to a traumatized little boy that I wanted to take in my arms and comfort. I never looked at Roy the same again. I knew his secret, or at least one of his secrets. And I understood. One of the invitations of marriage is to convert the irritation that comes from our differences in marriage into humility and compassion. The ability to understand that what our partners do makes sense to them. And when what they do doesn't make sense to us, it's because we don't understand them. Now, it doesn't mean they're right. Not everything our partner says or believes is correct or sensible. But they believe what they believe for reasons that make sense to them. And when we understand those reasons, then we understand why they do and say and act as they do. So, can you see the two practices that help us overcome bias? One is studying bias, recognizing that we as humans see through a glass darkly. We see imperfectly. We all have beams in our eyes. The second part is to try to see the faults in our own story, see the weakness in our own narrative, acknowledge and recognize that weakness. Now, this might be a good time, do you think, Andy, for people to look at the booklet? And I'll bet you one of the reflections is, if we had an all-day workshop, we'd probably take 15 minutes here and there for you to respond to questions. But look on page 6 where there's the reflection in that box that says, think about the possible mistakes and limitations of the position you have taken. See if you can discover where you might be missing important truths. And maybe the most important truth of all in marriage is, what does this mean to my partner? Why is this so important? Or why is this so tender? Or why is this so critical? And when we understand that, judgment falls away, and shall we say negotiation can begin, or understanding can begin. So that's the first part of overcoming our bias is humility. Let's see. Let's move to a second. One of the conflicts I have is that there's so much more we could say on each of these, but let's think about the second, which is compassion connects our hearts. Compassion. I hope everyone here is okay with me telling a story that I think is very, very well known, and it may or may not fit with your personal beliefs, but let me use it because it teaches so well the principle. It's a story that's often called the Good Samaritan. And the story, if you remember, has a man whose occupation, age, and details are entirely unmentioned. It says a certain man, as he journeyed, went from Jerusalem to Jericho. So a certain man makes this journey from what seems like to us in modern times 2 arbitrarily chosen cities. Until you understand that in Jewish lore, Jerusalem is the holy city. It's that sacred place. It's the place where God dwells. And he went to Jericho, which, if you know your geography, Jericho was the lowest inhabited city on the face of the earth. So we have a man who's traveling from a glorious place to a very low place. I'll bet some of us can relate to that in life. Those here who are especially sensitive people sometimes feel like this world is pretty likely to beat us up, leave us damaged, injured, and naked by the side of the road. Well, in the story, it says that there were 2 who passed by, a priest and a Levite. And again, to the modern ear, that may not mean much. Priest, that's the top of the social order for Jews. Levite, that's the lowest. Jesus is bracketing the entire social order of Judaism and saying nowhere in the organization was there compassion. That they may be officials, but they did not have hearts that cared about other people. So then it says, and then one who was a Samaritan. Again, that's a place that would be hard for us to appreciate. It'd be about like us hearing that someone from Al-Qaeda, a trainer for Al-Qaeda, came by. We can little appreciate how offended the Jews were by a Samaritan. But it says, as he journeyed, whereas the other two came by chance. Don't you think that's significant? That it says, as he journeyed. In other words, that man was out looking for people who were injured. He wasn't just on a journey. He wasn't just meeting his own needs. He made his life's journey focused on looking for people who needed a hand. So Jesus holds him up as the local hero and it says when he saw him, you know what the next two words are? Yeah, somebody said it. He had compassion. He had compassion. Now notice, we don't know the rationale of the priest and Levite. We don't know what their thinking was. They may have felt like, man, this guy, any guy who's traveling alone on this road deserves to be beat up, even though they were doing that themselves. So we don't know what their thought process was, but there was one, a Samaritan, who had compassion. And then he ministered to him, binding up his wounds in ways that are profoundly symbolic, and then put him on his own beast and walked alongside the beast while he carried him to a healing place. And one of the things, I don't understand a lot about Jewish culture, but I appreciate that in the story it says that he told the innkeeper that he would pay anything and everything, every expense that was incurred in the healing of the man, and then left 2 pence in addition. 2 pence, which is exactly the amount of temple tax for a Jewish man of the era. In other words, Jesus says, you may get yourself all beat up and maybe dying by the side of the road, but I will not only minister to your healing, but carry you to a place that will continue to minister, and I will provide temple tax for you so that God has no claim on you for a year while you heal. Wow. It feels pretty rich to me with meaning about the subject at hand, which is compassion. Compassion. It's really the willingness to feel the pain of someone else, regardless of their deservingness. A side trip. When children are first born, you can play pink noise for them and they'll show interest and no distress. Pink noise is the sound to which human ears are responsive. You can play the same amount of sound of another infant crying and the child will start to cry. Isn't that interesting? We come pre-wired with compassion, and then we spend a lifetime training it out of ourselves, feeling compassion only for those we like, those we care about. And when somebody we like gets hurt, we feel it keenly, even physically sometimes. But when there are those who we disagree with or at odds with, we think, well, they deserve it. And compassion suggests that it's not about deservingness. Let me give you a story that I think illustrates that idea. Years ago, Nancy and I and our family lived in Vernal, Utah, and Andy has an older sister named Emily. When Emily was in kindergarten and we lived just across the street from the elementary school, little Donna would come from up the street to our house and knock on the door and ask if Emily could go with her to play at the playground. And more often than not, the answer was sure. Yeah, just be back at this time and etc. Whatever seemed like reasonable requirements. So one particular day, Donna came and she knocked on the door and we authorized Emily to go with her. I should make this explanation. I've told this story in the pamphlet, but Donna is now a very obscure name, so we changed her name. Hope you won't be offended. The story is true, even if the name has changed. So, the two girls went running to the street to cross over to the elementary school. When they arrived at South Vernal Avenue, Emily stopped and Donna did not. Donna ran out into the crosswalk and was hit by a passing car. Boy, that was an interesting pretest of compassion. Some of you feel it very physically, don't you? And the good news, such as it was, is that the driver of the car had seen these two girls come running, and he had slowed down, wondering if they were going to stop and watch for traffic, but he had not gotten stopped. So he hit Donna. She flew some distance and got a pretty good case of road rash. Later we learned that there were no broken bones, and she healed completely. But imagine what it was like for Donna to be hit by a car, thrown some distance, and to be sprawled in the street. Would it be appropriate for me to go to Donna and say, you know, Donna, I'll bet you've been told about looking before you cross the street. So what we're going to do is go inside and get some orange cones we have just for such an occasion and put you in timeout, a minute for every year of your age. Would that be an appropriate response, a compassionate response to her pain? No, it'd be almost abusive, wouldn't it? Indeed, she was foolish. Indeed, she brought it on herself. No question about it. But what compassion is about not wanting to see any suffer. And so rather than put little cones around her and give her a lecture, rather than that, we would send someone inside to get a damp washcloth to wipe the open wounds. We would send someone else to get her parents. We would call for whatever medical help was appropriate, a doctor we know or a nurse. We would do everything and anything we could to minister to her healing, in spite of the fact that she brought it on herself. So sometimes we think of compassion as this feeling of sympathy we have for those who have been unjustly treated, and it is that, but it's more. It's for anyone who's suffering, we feel compassion, we feel concern, we feel touched by their infirmities. So there are several ways that help us build compassion. We've identified some. One is to stay peaceful. Stay peaceful. When we let our minds go into hyperspace about blaming and analyzing, we don't do especially well at compassion. So the first is to stay peaceful. The second is to recognize that our perceptions are not the whole story. We only see a fraction of what's what. And when we can see into their life and experience, it's more promising than when we just impose our meaning on their actions. The third is listen to and understand the feelings of the other person. And these points I think you'll see ticked off identified in your workbook. To listen to and understand the feelings of others. There's a story I really like because I can't imagine me doing it, but I wish I would. It's about a guy who was a long-haul trucker and he'd be gone all week long, and he and his wife set up a custom where when he got back on Friday evening, she'd have dinner ready for them, and they'd have an evening that was very special. And it had become a custom, and it was expected that by the time he arrived at 6 o'clock Friday, she'd have dinner ready and on the table, and they would have this nice time together. One Friday, nothing went right, and she was badly behind schedule, and as she heard his truck drive up and park in the yard, she had not even begun dinner. And she thought, oh man, he's going to be so angry, he's going to feel like I don't care, and he's going to, etc., etc., all those catastrophizations that we make. The man came in the house and didn't smell dinner. He looked in the kitchen, and before the wife could even apologize, he said, oh, good. I got home in time to help you with dinner. Dang, don't you want to hug that guy? If he were here, we'd pass him around. We'd all give him a hug. Because that's compassion, isn't it? He did not inquire and say, well, so you don't care about our dates, our time together anymore? You're taking me for granted. I don't matter, I guess. He didn't do any of that. He just said, "Oh, good." And that's one of the things I'm trying to learn to do in marriage with Nancy. Instead of be angry or disappointed, see everything that happens as an opportunity to bless each other. How do we apply compassion to our own situation? If you looked in your book, let's find where. So it talks about how to cultivate compassion starting on page 7, and then applying compassion in our own lives, our own situations, our own marriages, our own families, our own neighborhoods. Applying compassion to our own situation. Let me tell you another story that may be familiar to some of you because it's been shared at various times. A story about a woman who was in line in the Chicago airport, and a bunch of planes were canceled. Lots of flights were canceled because of snowstorms. And so people were queuing up to rebook new reservations. And long lines of people who were tired and hungry and frustrated because their travel plans had been messed up. So one particular evening, a woman who was pregnant and had a little baby with a obviously soaked diaper was standing way back in the line, and she, as she would move forward in line, would slide her child forward with her foot. You can guess what kind of reaction that elicited from the other travelers. Pretty soon they were kind of talking to each other and saying, "Wow, what kind of mama is that?" They were complaining about her and her actions, and it continued that way until a guy dressed in a business suit came up and said, "Would it be okay if I help you?" Bet you know what the answer was. He said, "Looks like your little girl is tired and hungry and wet." He said, "All I have to offer her is gum. Could she have some chewing gum?" And she said, yes. And so this man in his business suit picks up, and you think about, there's something about carrying a baby who is soaking that doesn't appeal to a person in a suit, don't you think? But he picked her up and he held her, and the mother explained, "I'm so sorry because this little girl is pretty unhappy, but I am threatening to miscarry, and the doctor has told me I must not carry her, or I will probably lose the baby with whom I'm pregnant." And she said, "So I really feel bad." But he said, "I'll tell you what, let's see if we can get you some help." So he worked his way up the line, talking to everyone in front of her, saying, "This poor lady's trying to get to Michigan, and she's got these 2 little girls. Would you let her go to the front of the line?" He worked his way down the line and eventually got to the front. Everyone was glad to let her go ahead. He took her to the front where she rebooked her flight only a fairly short time from then, and then he walked her to her gate, carrying the little girl and assuring that all was well and she was ready for her flight. Now, I don't know, does that feel like compassion to you? Is it not the human tendency to look at somebody and say, how come they're treating their little girl so badly? I mean, we can track through all the tendencies in our way of thinking, and the reality is that when we have compassion, we think differently. We think, I wonder if that person's overwhelmed. I wonder if they're exhausted. I wonder if they're confused. I wonder if they need a hand. I wonder how I can help. Rather than be a priest or Levite, we are a Samaritan, one who asks, how may I help? Now, for me, that's as good a story as any to illustrate the problem. I don't know about you. Maybe one reason I like the story so well is once when I was I was going to be going to Auburn, Alabama, where I was actually interviewing for a job, which I later got. And they had arranged for me to fly into Atlanta and then take a shuttle. And as I boarded the shuttle, I saw a woman with about 5 kids and all their luggage trying to get across the parking lot to her car. And I knew in my soul that I should help her. But I was so worried about the shuttle leaving me behind that I didn't. And now, if it were to happen, I would ask the shuttle driver, how long have I got? And as it turned out, I had about an hour to sit there and stew. And if I were doing it again, I would say, here's my luggage. I'll be back within half an hour. And I would help a woman with 5 children get to her car. Do you think that if we did that in our families, in our neighborhoods, if we did that in our schools, workplaces, I think it'd make a difference? I think it would. And as I said, compassion has that special character that it assumes that people do what they do for reasons that make sense to them, even if the reasons do not make sense to us. They do what they do for reasons that make sense to them. And instead of insisting that people think and act the way we do, we try to help. So let's see if, look at the reflections there. Under applying compassion to your own situation, he says, let's return to the conflict that we invite people to think about a conflict that may have been an enduring one, and maybe a difficult one in your marriage or family or extended family or whatever. How could you use the principle of compassion to help you successfully connect your heart to the other person's heart? Just a side note. As a person who studies parenting literature, I could name for you 100 mistakes that my mom and dad made. Would that be compassionate? Did mom and dad do absolutely the best they knew how, and under difficult circumstances with 7 kids and very little income, they did everything they knew to do? Yes. So sometimes our knowledge and skills is used as a bludgeon against those who may have less than we. And that's always a shame. It's a shame when we use the gifts with which we've been blessed to whack other people. So the third key, which you'll see there on page 9, is positivity. There are other words you might prefer. Positivity is one of the best attested principles of relationships. The research is overwhelming. Let's return to John Gottman. John Gottman has always been an iconoclast. He took commonly received ideas and challenged them by actually doing research to see if they were true. One of those was that avoidant relationships where you say, honey, let's not be unpleasant, let's not talk about it, and volatile relationships where you go, oh! You get excited and upset. The assumption was that volatile and avoidant relationships are destructive, and that validating relationships were the right ones. That's where, when your spouse says you're an idiot, low-life, scumbag, scoundrel, you say, wow, thank you for sharing that, dear, that'll make me think. That's what everybody assumed, and it's what even many therapists to this day teach, because it's kind of woven into the therapist's soul. But the reality is that the research says something very different, and some of you know what it is, some of you may not. There's one thing that matters terribly about the quality of relationships, and it is simply this: a ratio of 5 positives for every negative. According to the research, and you can read it in Gottman's book, Why Marriages Succeed or Fail, he talks about how all 3 of the relationships, volatile, avoidant, and validating, all 3 have unique advantages and disadvantages. So for instance, in the traditional validating relationship, it sometimes settles into this passionless, business-like relationship that may not be satisfying to some people. So it has advantages. There's less conflict and more cooperation, but there also sometimes is less passion. But what Gottman found is that while each kind of relationship has its advantages, there was one thing that mattered terribly, critically, essentially. The core thing was whether there were 5 positives for each negative. Isn't that interesting? Now let's combine that with research by Sandra Murray. Sandra Murray is a woman she did a study and nobody believed what it said, so she did it again and again. We call it replication, where you keep getting the same results, and so finally people say, well, it must be true. What she found is that, like for instance, if you interviewed Wally and asked him what Nancy's qualities are, Wally would name qualities that no one, including her own family, recognizes. He would speak of her in such glowing terms because he loves her and sees those good qualities. And so some people thought, well, maybe it's because in marriage you know each other so well, so you see more qualities. But the research suggests otherwise. The research says that in happy relationships, people look for the good. They're biased. They're biased in a positive way. They choose to look for the good and celebrate it. The distortions are positive distortions instead of negative ones. Instead of judging our partners, instead of thinking them foolish and inadequate, instead of thinking they're dopey and ought to do things our way, in healthy relationships, people have what she calls positive illusions. Positive illusions. Isn't that a great phrase? Positive illusions. They look for the good, they notice it, they celebrate it, they talk about it, they maybe even put pictures in their workplace that shows them with their spouse in happy times. Maybe they make a list of qualities they see in their spouse and keep it in their billfold or purse. And in happy relationships, people they wear what Gottman calls rose-colored glasses. They're Pollyannish in their focus on what's good. Now, isn't that interesting? That has been profoundly painful for many scientists. In fact, Andy remembers that Martin Seligman, his one bit of marital advice reduces to this: hold on to your illusions. Now that sounds a little bit cynical, doesn't it? Like any good qualities you see are just invented. Or the other way you've said it, Andy, is I'll always cherish the original misconceptions I had of you. A great statement. The fact is that nothing predicts how strong a marriage is as well as when you ask a couple how they met and what first attracted them to each other. Those who have ready access, those who can say, I always thought she was the most radiant person I'd ever met. Wow. If you can access what first attracted you, then your relationship is probably still strong. If in contrast you have let an overburden of unhappiness and confusion and argument and disagreement pile over those perceptions, then marriage becomes a slog, an uphill battle, a disagreeable chore instead of a source of joy. And the reason it's so fascinating is some psychologists like Martin Seligman just scratch their heads and say, as a therapist, I spent most of my career trying to get people back down to terra firma, back down to earth, get them be realistic. But the research on marriage says that's the wrong thing to do. That having positive illusions is the right thing to do. Now, they don't have to be dumb and silly. Like, I don't have to believe that Nancy loves Schrodinger's time-independent, non-relativistic three-dimensional wave equation. She doesn't. And when I was dating, I thought I would like somebody to sit around and talk about Schrodinger's wave equation. Wouldn't that be fun, Marcus? And Nancy never has been into that. And Nancy was none of the things I listed and everything that I needed. In some ways, my polar opposite, who has enriched and stretched me from that day in January 41 years ago. So, positivity, it is, it's hard to say everything that should be said about that, because it is, as I said, the central finding. In fact, there's a book called Positivity by Barbara Fredrickson, who is the queen of that research. And she points out that even in the workplace, if you want to know how productive a team will be, then start assessing the positivity. And in the workplace, the ratio is generally 3 to 1. Now, some of that's probably measurement difference, but maybe positivity is more important in couple relationships. I don't think the research can tell us yet which is true. But if you want a good work team, if there are people who work with you and for you, there's nothing like appreciation, positivity, encouragement to build a team. And the old medical model says exactly the opposite. When somebody's a mess, we need to tell them and remind them and set up an accountability program. And what happens, of course, is that we all start to define ourselves in terms of our faults. The new mantra of positive psychology is use your strengths and manage your weaknesses. Use your strengths and manage your weaknesses. If you're like me, you're one of those guys who thought Benjamin Franklin's program of taking the 13 virtues and working at them one at a time until you perfected them all, maybe you thought that was sensible, and it turns out to be remarkably bad advice. That in fact, each of us will be strong at some things and weak at others. And this might be a good place to encourage you to look at www.AuthenticHappiness.org, where you can take for free, if you go to the ORG site, AuthenticHappiness.org, you can take the Values in Action Survey of Character Strength. It's 240 items, and it tells you of the 24 strengths identified in humans, which are your top 5, which he calls your signature strengths. It's as unique as your fingerprint, your unique set of top strengths. And when you start to think of your spouse in those ways, in terms of qualities, and you start to think of yourself in those ways, it can really change our thinking, can't it? Please. I'm glad you asked, because there are a whole bunch of assessments, including mood and happiness assessments. But the one in particular is the VIA Survey of Character Strengths. And they have it in both an adult and child version. The adult is 240 items, which is a lot of items. It'll take most people 35 to 60 minutes to complete it. But when you're done, it'll say, here are the 5 character strengths in which you excel. And to do that, dear Andy and Natalie have even done that for on behalf of their little children, so they could think about their children's qualities and appreciate and value them. Instead of be irritated by what they are not, they can celebrate what they are. And it makes sense, doesn't it? One of the, I don't know if you see a recurring theme, at least I do. The recurring theme is that much of what we assume to be true is simply false and counterproductive. The natural husband is an enemy to his wife. The natural wife is an enemy to her husband. Unless we get our hearts changed. Unless we find ways to bring humility, compassion, and positivity to our perceptions and processes. I should be clear and say that the research says every relationship has conflict. If you're not having any conflict in your marriage, you're not spending enough time together. Every relationship has conflict. But, oh man, this is really interesting finding in The Science of Trust. It's Gottman's newest book, where he says people who have unhappy marriages tend to slip into conflict easily and find it hard to get out of it. Whereas people who are happily married tend to find it hard to get into heavy conflict, and when they do, they get out more easily. They use what he calls repair attempts, like a sense of humor. Or, like sometimes when I start to get irritated about something silly, I know that what I ought to do with Nancy is make fun of myself and say, Nancy, I wish you had married a better man who didn't get irritated about such silly things. And once we change our hearts in that tiny way, it really changes the discussion. But my sense is that it usually takes most of us decades to do that. Decades of some pretty hard work to get to that place. So that third key is positivity. And some of you who are interested, there are a lot of great books on that, because it's, as I said, one of the best attested facts of modern research on human relationships. Let's put some flesh on those bones. I read a story, as happens in the Reader's Digest, about a couple that had been married for 50 years. And so they had a big anniversary party, and friends, family gathered around them and celebrated. And of course, then they turned to serious discussion. Like somebody asked the couple, what's the key to your success? You've been married 50 years and by all appearances are incredibly happy. What's the key? And the woman said, well, when we first married, I told him that for the sake of our relationship, I would forgive him of 10 faults. And someone in the crowd said, well, what are they? Isn't that funny about human nature? That we really love to understand each other's faults. And the woman replied, to tell you the truth, I never got around to listing his 10 faults, but every time he did something that made me hopping mad, I just said, it's a good thing for him that's one of the 10. That's something that it may have various names. What I call it is pre-forgiveness. The person doesn't have to ask for or beg your forgiveness. You have already decided ahead of time to not hold them hostage to your discontents. It's pre-forgiveness. I've already forgiven that person for any mistakes they'll ever make. I've pre-forgiven. And it's a different mindset, and it's part of positivity. So Andy, we ought to look at some of these reflections, shouldn't we? And you can see that like for instance on page 11, we appreciate that our artist drew shriveled up small heart. He said he thought that green was like pond scum. I kind of like green myself, but the green heart on page 11, and then medium, large, extra large hearts. I bet we've all known people who had gracious, loving, generous hearts, and we're so grateful to them. Nancy has been pre-forgiving me for 41 years, and I'm profoundly grateful to her for doing that. So the reflections, like on page 10, what good qualities does this person have? See, that's positivity. It's one of the things Gottman recommends is list, make a note, keep it with you perhaps, of your partner's qualities. And then the next reflection, what temporary circumstances may be contributing to your conflicts? How are you re-scripting your memories of the relationship through the eyes of your current problems and frustrations? In other words, one of the things that research has found is that when people have conflict in happy marriages, they say, oh, this is temporary, it'll pass. This isn't what this relationship's really about. This is temporary. I mean, it's only been this way for 20 years. It'll go away. But when the relationship is good, they have this bias that they say, this is it. This is the real stuff. This is what this relationship is about. This is who we are. And it's a bias. I mean, maybe I'm overdwelling. My point is, we all tend to favor objectivity, especially in American scientific culture. And it turns out to be very unproductive in healthy family relationships. That choosing to, like for instance, I have no idea why my Aunt Mary thought I was wonderful. I sometimes thought she needed a little mental health support. But Aunt Mary always acted like she wanted me to come visit and hang out at their house. And I thought, wow. And Aunt Mary's changed the world. When there's somebody who isn't keeping score, but is rather filled with appreciation, it changes everything. And our nature tends to be to keep score. Let's look at other reflections. Please, Andy. That would be excellent. Good idea, Andy. Andy's a lot better at making applications. So should we take a minute and you can scribble a few words there? Is that what you're thinking, Andy? And if you get through with the first couple, you might go on to the next couple. Good idea, Andy. in an ideal situation, we'd all have a lot of time to reflect on and maybe even discuss our answers to some of these questions. But we're about to run out of time, and I know Andy wants a few minutes at the end. Let me conclude by saying we think knowledge and skills are important, but they won't make any difference unless our hearts are right. As long as our hearts are accusing and cold and negative, then skills will be only in the service of destruction, not building. So, heart. We don't want to diminish their importance, but say that that's the critical catalyst that enables knowledge and skills to be useful in building relationships. So, as I conclude, let me just ask you if any of you have questions before we turn the mic to Andy. Questions? Some of you may have come late and didn't get a workbook. For that, I apologize. Let us get you one if that's the case. And I also will be glad to give you my email address. You're welcome to write if you have questions, or if you're just sick of positivity and you want to vent on somebody. My address is wgoddard at UAEX for University of Arkansas Extension .edu. So you're welcome to write, and we've given you our website where you can also find all of our programs on parenting, personal well-being. I wish we had all the time to talk about personal well-being, because it's fascinating that most of us think the things that will make us happy turn out not to be. But maybe there'll be other times when we'll get together. But thanks so much for letting me be part of this with you. Thank you. Want this, Andy?
How many of you found value in what Wally had to share today? Good. Let's give him another warm welcome. Thank you. It occurred to me during our training that, Natalie and I spend most of our time and energy on our doTERRA business these days. And it occurred to me that in my belief system, we won't take that business, that doTERRA business, with us out of this life. But the relationships will. And the most important relationship, I believe, is with your partner, with your spouse. So hence our emphasis on relationships. And that's been the focus of our personal development so far this year. How many of you heard the phrase, "as a man thinketh"? I think just about the whole personal development industry is kind of built on that one phrase. But how many of you know the rest of that phrase? As a man thinketh? In his heart. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So I believe that there's lots of great information out there. There's lots of books. We can spend a lot of time in our head, but it's not until we get to our heart that it has an impact. So thank you again, Dad. Let's give him another warm thank you. Many of you are in doTERRA. So what are some other tools that we have in doTERRA as partners to strengthen our relationship and to heal each other? Oils. Yeah. It's comical to me how often I can go without thinking of the oils as a solution to a lot of our marriage issues. In particular, how many of you love the AromaTouch technique? What a powerful tool that is for us to serve our spouse and to be served, to give and to receive. Absolutely love what that offers. And any of you who have heard Dr. Hill present have felt, I think, some of that heart connection that, that came with the development of that process. On the worksheets, you may have noticed that I offer one-on-one coaching with couples. The process that I use is Byron Katie's work. You can go to thework.com and learn more about her process. How many of you have heard of Byron Katie? Just by show of hands. Okay, it's quite a few of you. That's been just a powerful tool in my own experience for shifting my heart and for helping others do the same. The thing that I've realized hearing my dad today is that that's what the work has done for me, is it's brought about these three processes or ingredients of humility, compassion, and positivity. And it does it in an experiential way. So it's not just an abstract idea. You get to experience humility as you identify your beliefs and turn them around. You start to have compassion. As you hear your spouse do the same, your compassion for them is deepened. And then ultimately, what was a source of stress and pain and just unhappiness becomes a source of positivity. And we look forward to that negative experience again so that we can flip the switch to positivity. So if any of you are interested, this is not what I do full-time, but I'd be happy to do a one-on-one session, or a two-on-one, I guess, is what that would be. So just fill out the form, and happy to do that. Question? Thework.com. Lots of great videos there. Lots of. She also has. If you go to iTunes, you can search for Byron Katie. She has lots of free video podcasts and audio podcasts. So, great resource there too. Natalie, anything you want to add before we talk about the? Yeah. Let me just share this so that people online can hear you.
You know, you could visit the Authentic Happiness site and do that free assessment for 1 week. You could do, what's that? For date nights. Yeah. Got some great ideas. So, and the one that Andy talked about, you can do that yourself. You can have that experience yourself, something that you could totally do. So, great ideas and a beautiful time to do it.
Thanks. One of the things that that I've come to learn as I've met with a lot of couples in doTERRA, usually the woman caught the vision and got started first. Now we've got a couple exceptions here, and so I acknowledge that, but generally, as is the case with me and Natalie, she took the ball and she ran with it for a full year before I really stepped in any way. So as partners start doing doTERRA together, sometimes there's a disconnect. There's a lag because the guy just hasn't been in the business. I know one couple who's, she put on her vision board, I'm going to bring my husband home. You know, that she got to Diamond and she was thinking that would be a dream come true, and it was a nightmare. The husband came home and she's like, "What are you doing? You don't know how to do this business." It was quite different from what she expected. In fact, she started doing job searches and leaving it up on the internet for him to find. So I don't encourage that. I don't think that's the best possible outcome. So a new idea that we came up with as I met with this couple was doing a doTERRA men's club. Basically, we're gonna offer doTERRA Special Forces. So this is for men only. No women invited, no women allowed. And we're going to have a weekly conference call, and we'll have different guests. Brian Huddleston is passionate about Navy SEALs. He's been reading several books, so I'm excited to have him share some stories with us and inspire us that way. But here is the basic training. First, you have to be a man. Second, you have to share an oil sample with your own contact, invite your contact to a class, teach a class, that can be with a partner, and enroll at least one IPC by yourself. So I know lots of guys who are trying to coach team members and be an active participant, and they've never taught their own class, they've never enrolled anyone, and so I think it's hard to create the level of trust that's needed in a partnership and in himself without having done the business. When Justin Lee quit his job, he went on a trip to Houston and started knocking on doors and presenting doTERRA all by himself, enrolling people, got his brother signed up. He knew that he needed to pay the price in order for him to have a place in that business. So that's the intention. I'm going to send this around. There's a web address, sharedoterra.com/special forces. So we can just have a weekly call, hold each other accountable. If any of you want to take this idea and do it with your own team, a different way, feel free. This has been a collaborative effort of a lot of people, so I'm not trying to take any credit for it. But again, the intention is to create unity in marriages. So us guys are gonna take some time away from you women folk in this way so that we can be more united.
Or do you get like a month? Do you have to do the requirements before you can show up on the call? Or are you going to give like a month for people to share?
I think we ought to do, hop on the call, and then maybe that's a requirement for the first month. So that's in the first month, maybe that's basic training. Obviously, we haven't ironed out all the details. So if you're interested, hop on the call, hop on the website, join in.
I noticed the call is at 10 a.m. for some of these special forces. They're still in their JOB. I assume this will be recorded and available. How will the accountability be done?
So the call, and maybe we should take a vote. How many of you guys would be interested in participating in something like this? Just show of hands. How many of you would prefer to do it after hours, not during business hours? That probably makes sense. Okay. So should we say Wednesdays at 8 p.m.? Probably just a 30-minute call. Thursday's good for you? So we miss young men, young women stuff. Okay, so let's change that to Thursday at 8 p.m. And just tune into that website for recordings of the calls. And I think what we'll do too is we'll set up accountability partners. So this will be the group call that everybody gets on, but then we'll also set up partners so that you can have accountability to each other. You think maybe Tuesday? Tuesday, okay? Uh-huh. Okay. I think swing will be the exception rather than norm. Yeah. So, Tuesday? We could do. Okay, let's take a vote. If you were to vote Tuesday, let's push it back to 9 so maybe kids can get to bed. Tuesdays at 9. Vote for Tuesdays at 9 versus Monday. So who's in favor of Tuesday? Who's in favor of Monday at 9? Sheesh.
This may be just my life, but it seems like Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are the nights for most classes.
Busiest?
Like Mondays don't seem to to be that busy for classes. Fridays don't tend to be, but you have a date night, and we're here we're at a marriage seminar, so I'm thinking so that's why I'd say Monday, but just for my perspective, because otherwise I'll probably be teaching classes or something like that.
Okay. So that's a good argument for Monday, and it was about 50-50. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think most people are done by 9. I mean, we get a late start sometimes, but I think 9 is pretty safe. Okay, so Saturday midnight. So let's plan on Monday at 9 p.m. Mountain Time, and it will be recorded, so our East Coasters can listen to the recording if that's too late. But if you're man enough, you can stay up as late as 2 hours of sleep. Is that how much they average? 2 hours max? Okay. So this is the man test. So this page that we handed out is the man card, and for those of you watching, it's available at that web address, sharedoterra.com/special forces. So feel free to download that, print it, and have that be your tracking page. Well, thank you so much for being here today. It's such an honor to spend this time with you. It's an honor to have my parents here and have my dad share his knowledge and his expertise and his heart with us. So let's give
about some of the resources that are.
Sure. Yeah. There are some resources that my dad's worked on the tables. One of my favorites is the Marriage Garden. This has several interactive lesson guides. Are there 8 of them? 6. 6 lesson guides that take you through the core principles, as well as this awesome folder. Bruce Dupree, was he the illustrator? Good friend and colleague who's done a lot of, I think, all the illustrations for your Arkansas work. So, excellent resource. There's also the personal journey as well as the parenting journey. Oh yeah, See the World Through My Eyes. We don't have any here.
Managing stress as well.
Yeah, so 2 more programs, all available through arfamilies.org.
So just a question, with the university, how did all this fit into the Division of Agriculture?
Yeah, what a great question. How does this fit in with the Division of Agriculture? And like many things, it's a historical fluke that way back in 1862, when land-grant universities were established, for instance, in Utah, Utah State University was the agricultural college. And so the idea was that tons of research was being paid for by taxpayers' money, and the taxpayers ought to benefit from it without having to go to campus and pay tuition. So the government set up land-grant universities, and the tradition has morphed. Today, most families are not farm families, but we still have a dual mission. One is to help agriculture, and the other is to help families. So originally it was help farm families, but we really don't do, cow marriage and duck parenting and stuff. But we just happen to be embedded in the Division of Agriculture. Isn't that weird? Yeah, I agree.
Go Aggies. Awesome. Let's give him another warm round of applause. Thank you.